Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to talk about forest fires. Now, we're going to talk with an old friend of mine. This is a man I've known for maybe 40 years, and yet I've never had one conversation with him about his work. And yet I'm very, very interested in climate change. And of course, one of the main contributing factors, important factors in climate change is forest fires. And this guy is a specialist. So why didn't I talk to him years and years ago? I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to make up for it now. This is my friend Dave Martell. David Martell is I presume, professor emeritus of forestry, University of Toronto. Have I got that right, David?
That's correct.
Good. Okay, we're both emeritus. I've heard of
Yeah,
people pronounce it emeritus or something, but I think let's
it,
stick with
it varies. People vary in their
yeah.
pronunciation, but
Yeah.
I use the word emeritus just like you.
Yeah, I never looked it up. Okay, let's get started. All these years I've known that you were an expert on forest fires. And sometimes I know that if I've called and let's say, some reason I talked to Marion, I find that you're out of town. You've gone to a forest fire. And I've never asked, what do you do out there? So I want to find out about that job. You also go out and actually go to the field where there are things burning. So what do you do out there?
Well, I guess it's the other side of the table in the sense that what I go out there to do is to learn. Uh, when I started studying fire management systems, there were really no good textbooks to use. So I was fortunate that I had colleagues that were a couple of years ahead of me
Mhm.
that were doing field work, and one of my senior professors said one of his first pieces of advice when I joined the Faculty of Forestry was make sure you keep dirt on your boots. And a
Oh,
former
really?
and Yes, and what he was very much interested in what goes on in the field. And one of my colleagues was doing a lot of field research, experimental burning, and he was an alumnus of the University of Toronto, and he was uh, treated me like he did almost all young people. He reached out to give us a hand and help us get established. So the first thing he did was he invited me to come up and go to his experimental burns and see what he was doing and help out as a pair of hands and when samples had to be collected and stuff like
Okay, now
that. But
hold
but
on.
I was primarily out there to learn, not to do.
Yeah, you already used a word that completely surprised me. Experimental burns. Holy smoke. You mean he's out there setting fires to see what happens?
He's not doing that now, but he was
Oh,
doing that then,
yeah.
yes. We can
Really?
talk about that later if you wish. But
Well,
it was an
sure.
important part of his research program,
Uh-huh.
and it's an important part of the science program in Canada. So
Oh,
his idea was if you come out to the field, first of all, you'll learn something about fire behavior. But the other thing, he had another very important impact on me. And from time to time, when weather conditions became very severe, he was not able to ignite prescribed burns because they were concerned about them escaping. And at that point, he basically said, "Okay, we can't do any more experimental burning here. Let's go out and see what's going on in fire operations that is causing his research program to temporarily shut down." So we would go off and visit fire headquarters in different parts of the province and see, okay, what's going on these are no longer experimental fires. These are wildfires that are burning.
mhm.
So let's go out and see how they're behaving. But most importantly, he wanted me to come along because he wanted to introduce me to the field people who were managing those fires so that I could establish
Mhm.
uh, a relationship that eventually I could come back to them and when I needed to get a better understanding of what they were doing and why they were doing, then
Mhm.
I would have people in the field who I could reach out to and say, well, why did you do this and how did you do that sort of thing. So
Mhm.
that was a very important uh, step that he took to help me establish my career so that I would eventually be able to go out on my own to the field and learn.
Mhm. Well, now I assumed right from the get-go that all of the times when you were going out to fires, it was natural fires that were, and that you were going out to see what was going on, or maybe tell them how they should do it better. But at least part of that time, you were actually experimenting with fire, huh? And how
No,
much?
not at all. No, I wasn't experimenting at all. I
No.
was watching him conduct his experiment. I was an interested observer who was a pair of hands once in a while when you had to pick up some stuff and things like that.
Does the university do things like train firefighting people, experts who do the managing of fires, so that when there's somebody calls in and says there's a fire starting here, I presume you only work in Canada, is that right? Or do you go in other countries too?
Well, when I was going out, most of the time it was in Canada, almost all the time, but
Mm.
I've made a few international trips to see what's going on in other countries.
Yeah, because I know
But
we
most
have
of my
more than
research is focused in Canada.
yeah, we have more than, at least lately, more than our fair share of fires. But at any rate, I guess the question is, who trains the people who, go out and handle how, which trucks are going to go here and how many spades you need, and shall we send in planes with water and, things like that. How do those people get trained? And is that part of your job to teach them how to do it?
No, I'll make a distinction between fire operations and staff positions in those organizations. So when you and I think of firefighters in the province of Ontario in particular, we talk about fire ranger crews, typically four-person crews, and those people are hired by the Ministry of Natural Resources. In order to get their first job, they have to complete a training program. It's called an S100 program, and in the past the Ministry of Natural Resources taught that program, but now it's taught by small consulting companies, contractors that train. Basically, they train, in many cases, it's students, uh, and once they've passed that course, then they can be hired by the Ministry of Natural Resources, and some of them are, and some of them aren't.
Mhm.
Uh, but the people that I've taught students in the Faculty of Forestry, uh, were enrolled in what was called our Bachelor of Science in Forestry program. Some of the students that I taught and some of the graduate students that I taught later went on to assume positions in various levels within the organizations, primarily in Ontario, some in other provinces. But I was not training the firefighters per se, nor was I training the people that they hired. I was helping them. I was helping educate the ones in our Bachelor of Science program.
What kind of a training do they have as opposed to what you give forestry students who are studying apparently all kinds of other things about forests, including.
They start off as a junior crew member, and those that choose to stay in the fire program work their way up. They spend a few years in the crew system. Eventually, some of them become crew leaders, and then some of them become senior fire technicians within the fire program, and then they progress up through the ranks within the Ministry of Natural Resources. There's knowledge that they've gained from experience from each other, from reading the scientific literature,
Mhm.
from going to symposia where they learn about what's going on. But for the most part, it's like many occupations. They learn from their peers and other sources of knowledge as they work their way up through the rank. If you went to look at the forestry journals, you'd see typical science papers as you would in any other discipline. Do those people in the fire program read those papers and learn from them? For the most part, no. because these are, drilling down detailed scientific papers, some of which provide useful information that is eventually incorporated in the fire management programs. But take, for example, my research area. I kind of, when I look at the landscape of who does fire research, there's basically fire behavior people that study the chemistry and physics of fire. There are fire ecologists that study the impact on fire on ecosystems, and there's an emerging important new group called Human Dimensions of Wildland Fire, people who are primarily social scientists who are interested in the impact of fire on people and societies. My
Mhm.
area is the fourth area. It's fire management systems. So what my students and research assistants and I do is we study problems like, for example, one of the areas that we're working on now is air tanker deployment. How many? If you look at the province of Ontario, if you were out there as a fire manager and you were trying to decide what do I have to do to prepare for tomorrow? Well, one of the things that you would have to do is to decide, okay, how many air tankers do I have and where should I pre-position them? Because Ontario is a big place, so you can't cover the entire province. So,
And now
so
hold on,
you
because I
need
never have heard of air tanks before. What's
air
that?
tankers are the big yellow birds that you see,
Oh,
CL415s
oh,
and twin otters.
oh,
Sorry, I mispronounced it. Air tankers.
oh. He would have some on call ready to fill in with water, or what do they put in?
So basically, what we use in Ontario are amphibious air tankers. So if you Google, you'll see a CL415, and this is an air tanker that is amphibious. It's based on an airport, and when there's a fire that's reported, the first thing the duty officer, there'll be a duty officer in the regional headquarters, regional response center, who will have to decide this is many decisions. The first decision is, do I fight this fire or do I observe it? If I fight this fire, do I send an air tanker to it? And how many crews do I send to it? So part of my research is back up the chain of decision making that to inform the decision how many air tankers should you put at each airport each day so that when fires occur tomorrow, you reduce the distance between where the air tankers are and where the fires are. So if you can predict roughly where most of the potentially destructive fires are going to occur, then
Mhm.
you want to position the air tankers there. So that's an interesting decision-making problem. And as a researcher, my background is in operations research management science. So one of the things that my students and I do is we develop mathematical models that can be used to model those deployment systems and suggest what are the best decisions to make. So,
Mhm.
so
Well, are there
that
plenty of
research
these?
has yet to be implemented. Okay, that's the research we're working on now. But there's earlier research that we've done that's focused on decision making, and some of our results are incorporated in the fire management systems in Ontario.
Are there plenty of these air tankers so that you can always just decide the optimum place to put them, or do you have to decide, better order some more because we expect more trouble this summer?
Well, that's interesting. You'll notice in the press these days, the province of Ontario currently owns 9 CL415s, and they own 3 Twin Otters. But there's a lot of discussion in the public domain these days about do we need more air tankers and should they be owned by the provinces? Should be they owned by the federal government? There's an interesting sort of discussion going on there. But the answer to your question is they could always use more, not surprisingly, but they're very expensive. They're very expensive to purchase, and they're very expensive to operate. So
And they're never
so
never used for anything else. There's no dual.
Well, that's interesting. The CL415s are not used for anything else in Canada. Uh, but the Twin Otters that are deployed to be used as air tankers can also be used for other purposes. They may have to do some minor configuration on them, but
Like if now let me just imagine that you have a forest fire in a now there's we make a distinction between boreal forests and what so I've heard people refer to Carolinian forests or something. Is that the word that is used for deciduous forests?
Yes,
Yeah.
but most where most of the fires that occur in Ontario are in the boreal forest, and
Uh-huh.
those are the ones that you hear most about, with the exception of this summer, because we also have fires in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest. So if you want to think Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, think Algonquin Park. That's a significant part of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, and fires behave very differently in the boreal forest than they do in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest.
So now let's imagine that there's a fire reported in Algonquin Park, let's say. Now, how do you decide what is the most effective thing? Should you send these air tankers out, or is it better to go out there and with a bunch of people cutting down, making a what do you call those lanes where they clear the clear things so it won't move from one spot to another?
Fire lines.
Yeah.
That's a good question, and there's something that it's important to understand is air tankers don't put fires out. Air tankers help people put fires out. So the first decision, Ontario has a very sophisticated, relatively new fire management policy called appropriate response. So in the past, when a fire was reported in Ontario, in the areas, the so-called intensive protection zone, they would send a crew of firefighters either by road if it was close or by helicopter. And their job was to carry out initial attack on that fire and bring it under control as quickly as possible. And they still do that to fires that require suppression today. But the secondary decision will be, do they have to send air tankers to that fire? So basically, the decision that's made today if a fire occurs in Algonquin Park uh, is that a fire that has to be fought right now, or is it not doing potentially not potentially threatening a lot of values or people? Can we just observe it for a while and let it do its natural thing, or do we have to suppress it now? If it suppress it now, they will send crews, and it will typically be either in a helicopter or in a truck. The third decision will be, uh, okay, do we need air tanker support on that fire? So the person that's responsible for making those decisions, there's sector response officers who are in the local headquarters, and there's a regional duty officer who's based in Sudbury who will make those decisions. So they sort of make them together.
I'm not sure. The guys on the ground, I should say, firefighters, because you corrected me when we had an email exchange. You said firefighters I said guys or men, and you said a lot of women now do it. I didn't know
Most
that.
definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, whoever's in charge, what do they do? Let's say they are not going to use tankers, but they are going to try to suppress the fire. Do they
Yes.
cut trees? Do they squirt water themselves? Are there chemicals? What is it? What are the basic tools that they or approaches that they use to try to limit the spread of the fire?
So in Ontario, they make extensive use of pumps and hose because you'll be well aware we have lots of lakes and lots of rivers and lots of water in Ontario.
Mhm.
So sometimes when Ontario firefighters are sent to other parts of the country or other parts of the continent, uh, their first reaction is we want to put water on the fire, and they're sometimes referred to as the plumbers because they're very good at figuring out how to get water on a fire. So basically, the typical scenario will be this. So the a four-person crew and their equipment will be dispatched to that fire, and there will be a an incident commander. The leader of that four-person crew will scout that fire from the helicopter and have a good idea of what it's doing and where it might go, and look for possible places to set up pumps, and then they will land, and then the crew will set up a pump on a pond or a stream or a lake, and then they will lay hose up to the fire, and then they will go around the fire with these high pressure pumps, and basically uh, extinguish the perimeter of the fire. And these are, these are the I wouldn't use the word squirt. These are very high pressure hoses, a very strong flow of water,
Mhm.
and it accomplishes two things. So basically, uh, if you think of a forest that's got moss and pine needles on the floor, then they'll go through and they'll use that hose pressure to build a trench around the fire,
Mhm.
uh, and essentially stop it from spreading. If they can, if the fire is too intense and burning with such intensity that it's got flame heights and it's spotting ahead, then they won't be able to do that until air tankers have come in and hit it. So the second decision will be, okay, are we going to have some air tankers drop some water on the fire before the crews go in on the ground to make their job more feasible?
Where to put these trenches? Because if I presume if you dig a trench, because that's where you hope to contain the thing, and the embers are not going to blow over and start a fire on the wrong side of it, right? So is that part of the work, is trying to decide where to dig your trench?
Oh yeah, the trench will always be right at the edge of the fire, and the crew leader and or who's the incident commander will make that decision if that's going to be effective. Now, what you're talking about is what do they do if they have a very intense fire? So suppose they have an intense fire that's burning towards a river. Uh, what the crew leader will decide is, well, first of all, it's not safe to put people on the ground. You don't put firefighters at risk. You don't put them in front of a fire that's too dangerous. So you look at the big picture and you say, I mean, he or she will look at the big picture and say, okay, I've flown this fire. I see how it's behaving now. I see the kind of vegetation that's there. And by the way, fire people don't refer to the word vegetation or trees. They call fuel. So they say, what kind of fuel is between the fire and the river? And they say, okay, uh, if this fire reaches the river, it will probably jump across. So what we have to do is widen the river effectively. So they will go in and do some burning out. They will get a helicopter, will come in and do a burning out operation, starting at the river and doing strips of fire gradually, starting at the river and going closer and closer to the fire. So eventually, if everything works out all right, the combination of the river and the area that's been burned out is wide enough so that when the fire reaches that, it's the buffer zone is now wide enough that it's not likely to spot across the river. But it doesn't end there, because there will possibly be some fires that will spot across the river. So what they'll do is they'll say, okay, I want an air tanker so that if spot fires start on the other side of the river, then the air tanker can drop on it. So it can get busy and complicated.
Mhm. Is it just partly guesswork?
No, it's not guesswork at all. So these people are trained and experienced, and depending on the size of the
Mhm.
fire, they have many years of experience. And do they make mistakes? They possibly do. I haven't seen any. Uh, do they catch the fire all the time? No, they can't. They'll tell you what how certain they are that they'll be able to stop it, but they're not going to say they're 100% sure. So do some of those fires jump those boundaries sometime? I'm sure they do. I haven't documented that, but
How many people would be on a crew? Of course, that's going to have uh, depend on how big the fire is, but typically, I mean, we've got sometimes 6 or 10 fires going in Canada at the same time in the summers. I don't know, I don't have numbers, but uh, how many people go out and work on these teams for each fire on the average? And how do they get the people to do it?
okay, so we'll start with the small ones that we call the initial attack fires. And that's the fires that I described where basically a fire starts, a duty officer dispatches an initial attack crew, a four-person fire ranger crew, possibly in a helicopter, maybe with air tanker support. Should that fire escape and start to become a large fire, then what they will do is they will put crew leaders, they'll put more crews, and they will put an incident commander with more experience than a typical crew leader. So let's go to the extreme where you have large fires and when you asked Marion where I was going out. I was assigned to an incident management team as a research scientist. So an incident management team is comprised of 18 people. It's led by an incident commander. Uh, and there are many people on that team, but their job is to manage that fire. So they are going to have on that team 18 people, as I said, led by the incident commander. There's going to be a an ops chief who's responsible for putting the fire out or bringing it under control. There'll be a fire behavior officer who will be responsible for predicting how it's going to behave, how it's going to behave. There's going to be logistics people that are responsible for getting resources out to the line and keeping people fed. There's going to be accounting people. There's going to be maps people. There's all kinds of people in that group who are managing that fire. So they're managing the fire, but they're not the ones that are putting it out. They're managing it. They are going to have crews out on the fire line dealing with different parts of it. So typically the crews, a large fire will be partitioned into divisions. There may be 2 or 3 divisions, and each division will be partitioned, and there'll be a division supervisor in charge of each division, and each division is partitioned into sectors, and there'll be a sector boss in charge of each sector, and that sector boss will have a number of crews working for him or her on parts of the fire. So I don't have numbers, at my fingertips, but it's not at all unheard of to have hundreds of people on one of these large fires.
How do they recruit people to do that work?
Okay, so let's go to the scenario where initial attack fire escaped and they decided they need 5 more crews. Well, then they will have other crews that were on alert at the local base, and they will send some of them out. But if they decide that they don't have enough at the local base, then they'll bring them out from other bases. And if they don't have them in other bases there, they'll bring them from other parts of Ontario. And if they don't have enough in Ontario, they'll bring them from other parts of Canada. And if they don't have enough in Canada, then we start borrowing crews from other countries like Mexico and the United States and South Africa and other places. And you've seen a lot of coverage of that.
I've heard of that, and I was always impressed that countries are kind to each other that way. But so there are people in crews hanging around waiting for a fire. I mean, you say a base or different locations. They're already trained and ready to go. They're sleeping on cots in a dormitory or something, waiting for a fire. Is that it?
No, that's sort of what's happening. Suppose you went to a place like Sudbury. There would be crews on alert there. and there would be a certain number of crews on red alert, yellow alert, and blue alert. And the alert status of a crew basically indicates how quickly they have to get going.
Mhm.
So the ones that are in red alert, they have only a few minutes to get out in a helicopter and get going. There's lots of work to be done. As an example, whenever equipment comes back from a fire, it has to be cleaned, repaired, and reset up. So there's always lots of work to be done around a fire
Well,
base.
what about fire prevention? Do these crews take part in any kind of work to, now let's maybe move from talking just about fires to how do you keep the danger of fire reduced by questions like underbrush, clearing underbrush, and even you mentioned just letting you have to decide whether to bother to fight the fire at all, just let it burn.
There's several important aspects of a fire prevention program. Uh, and the typical fire prevention program is that people go out and they give talks in schools, telling kids not to play with matches, simple. Putting up prevention signs you see along the road and things like that.
Mhm.
Uh, and going to talking to community groups and stressing the importance of not starting fires and equally important how to report fires if they see one. You
You
tell
just call
people
911.
no, it's depends on what part of the province you're in.
Okay.
And I forget the numbers. There's a different number in Northern Ontario and Southern Ontario. But the other thing that you're talking about, you're alluding to is do they do fuel management?
Mhm.
So a very important part of of fire programs in Ontario and other parts of Canada is called fire smarting. And basically fire smarting involves and this goes across the country, Fire Smart Canada program. And basically the Fire Smart Canada program reaches out to people in communities at risk and tells them what they should do to reduce the threat to their homes and infrastructure
Mhm.
if a fire should approach the community. So there's a whole set of guidance about what to do, about what kind of roof you should have, whether you should clean dead pine needles out of your eaves troughs, whether you should have that you should not have flammable vegetation in your garden beside your house, that you should not have your wood pile near your house, that you should not have uh, a wooden deck near your house. There's a whole program there that's been ramped up in recent years
Mhm.
to tell people that live in communities at risk and people who have cottages and recreational buildings out on the landscape. So that's the major part of and people in the fire program don't really refer to that as prevention, but rather as mitigation. What do we do to mitigate the potential impact of fires that do cause threats to communities? But what you're also talking about is a larger problem that's people are becoming interested in recent years, and that's fuel management out on the larger landscape. Are there things that we can and should do to reduce the flammability of the landscape? And the answer to that is that's an important open question because
Mhm.
it, we got a big landscape, costs a lot of money. We're not sure the cost effectiveness of
Mhm.
what should be done. So we don't want to spend billions of dollars that aren't going to be effective. So there are some things that we know. So forest companies have to treat some of their fuel some of the slash that they create in logging. They have to get rid of it as a risk. One of my former students, Jennifer Beverly at the University of Alberta, has developed an important new uh, contribution in this area. She and her students have developed methods of identifying if you look at a particular community, where are the fires that are going to pose the most significant threat to this community going to come from? And then say, okay, if we can't afford to treat the fuels around the entire community, but given what we know about fire behavior and fuels,
Mhm.
this is an area that represents the biggest risk. So let's go in and potentially do some fuel management in that part of that circle around the town. They can replace the flammable vegetation with less flammable vegetation. The basic question is, what can and should we do to this potentially flammable fuel? How much is it going to cost, and how far out from our community should we go? Those are important open questions for which there are no simple answers.
I think Trump made a statement that was, I believe, controversial at the time about we should go into forests and clear the litter off the forest floor, remove all the branches and debris and things that have fallen from the trees, and that this dry material is what could cause the fire. And if we just take that out, we wouldn't have all these fires. I may be simplifying what he said, but at any rate, I think there was some debate about whether or not that was a reasonable thing. I would assume that you obviously can't do that for a whole forest, but is it even a good idea? Because I've heard people say, well, if you take all these things off the forest floor, you're depraving the roots of the trees of the nutrients that they would get as these things decay and return to the earth. Tell me, what is a practical answer if there is a single answer to that question?
Well, there isn't a single answer. It basically depends on what kind of forest you're talking about,
Mm,
uh, and what's the potential risk of a fire, and then what kind of a fire will burn. So one of the fuel treatments that's often done in Canada is to go out and you can Google it and see that they're putting some large fuel breaks around Banff where they're basically cutting all of the trees. Okay. Uh,
mhm,
I'm not an ecologist. You'd have to talk to them, and I'm sure it's a Parks Canada operation, so
mhm.
they would have had some of their ecologists involved in that decision. But somebody has decided that in that particular area, it's appropriate to go in and cut all the trees. Okay. Now, well,
This would be like a strip around the perimeter, or uh,
yes,
yeah.
around part of the perimeter, yes.
Mhm.
Uh, there's also a massive effort to put in major fuel breaks around, I believe it's Whitehorse in the Yukon. If
Mm,
you Google that, you'll see that. So that's one solution. But there are many other places where they just go in and they say, you know what? What we want to do here is we don't need to cut all the trees. If we thin the trees, cut out a certain percentage of them, then if there is a fire with a combination of firefighters on the ground and air tankers from above, we'll have a greater chance of containing that fire before it hits the town.
mhm.
So there are no simple answers. Basically, if there is a community at risk, then the people in the community and the fire people have to sit down and decide what they think is best for them. And there are no simple solutions.
Right. Well, I know I have a lot of family in California, and I remember some of them were pretty close to a fire. I remember that there was a conversation about the advice that was being given. People were saying, "You guys shouldn't have ever built houses there. There are certain places where it's really stupid to build a house because you're just asking for it." So do they insurance companies, for example, I would think would say if you build a house here, just like if you build a house on a floodplain or something, we're not going to insure you. I don't know whether they do, but is that the kind of calculations that people make about where it's safe to build houses and where it's not?
you're asking me about questions for which I don't have good answers, but I'll give you some opinions. Uh, these kinds of questions have only emerged in recent years. People
Mm,
built those houses a long time ago.
mm,
Uh, in some cases, it may be unfair to come back to them now and say, well, now we know this about fires, you shouldn't have done it. Uh,
mm,
I believe there are some parts of the United States where the insurance companies will not insure some houses, but don't quote me on that. I don't know specifically where. The bigger question is, are insurance companies getting more interested? They most definitely are. So the major insurance companies are starting to pay a lot more attention to forest fires than they ever did in the past. But I'm not sure that there is a sort of a major cohesive response other than insurance companies would certainly tell homeowners that they should, you know, look into the Fire Smart Canada program and figure out how to fire smart their community
mm,
and fire smart their homes and fire smart their cottages. I am not aware that there are any insurance companies in Canada that will say, if you fire smart your home, we'll reduce your fire
mm.
insurance cost. I expect that will come someday. I don't believe it's there yet.
I have a friend who has a house down in Redwood Grove, and she said you just can't get insurance anymore. It's so expensive, it is just impossible. That what is happening is they are raising the price of insurance to an unaffordable level. And then I'm involved with a lot of people who are doing work on climate change prevention, that is, trying to use different technologies to reduce, well, mitigate climate change or repair climate change, and they would love to have the insurance companies take the lead in saying, look, there are technologies here that are being used, but people now use the word geoengineering as if it's a really naughty expression. Nobody wants to talk about geoengineering, and so the insurance companies are extremely reluctant to talk about doing anything like that. Whereas my friends who are out in the front on that issue were saying, we should be trying to get the insurance companies to take an initiative and try to promote government research and government funding and stuff on how to prevent uh, climate change issues, handling climate change issues, and because the insurance companies are the ones worst at risk. But what I understand most of the companies are doing is they are just expecting the whole industry to just gradually die. That it's going downhill because uh, climate change makes it unaffordable, and they just won't have insurance. So apparently, they're just plain not taking very very strong initiative. However, I've heard people talk about things on the other hand, initiatives that I would like to ask about, and one of those is about goats. I know somebody says that they rent herds of goats to go eat the underbrush or whatever around their property. Tell me about that.
Well, I've not been involved, but actually my family, I have family that lives in Logan Lake in British Columbia, which is was the first sort of fire smart community in Canada, and it's very proud of that fact. And they have done an enormous amount of fuel management around their community to reduce the fire threat to their community. And one of the things that they have done as well is they bring in a goat herder. I haven't seen the goat herder lately, but the last time I was there, the goat herder was there with his goats, and the goats were eating up the flammable underbrush that was putting the community at risk. So I know they certainly do it in Logan Lake, and I believe they've done it many other places. So that's an interesting approach to fuel management. That's how much of the landscape can you get goats to deal with? Not a lot, but it's a good thing to do because it's going to be environmentally friendly,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to get rid of some of the fire hazard. But it's a partial solution very close to the community, and they're doing it there, and I expect they're doing it elsewhere, and we'll do it increasingly.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about climate change because obviously there are more forest fires now, or at least I shouldn't say obviously. My understanding is that there are lately more forest fires and that there is a correlation, at least, between climate change and forest fires. Um, how much of the world's climate change or increasing global warming would you attribute, if you want to make a wild guess, to these forest fires? And to what extent is it really that they are the effect more than the cause of global warming? In other words, I presume that the forest fires happen primarily in the summer in areas where there's a shortage of water and when there's excess heat. And so the climate change may increase the flammability of the forests. Tell me about it. What's the relationship between climate change and forest fires?
And anybody that knows anything about forest fires knows that climate change is an important driver that's causing the more severe fire seasons, both
Mhm.
in Canada and elsewhere in the world. And people in the fire business have known this for a long time. I'm not a climatologist, this is not my research area, but some of my colleagues were writing articles back in the late 1980s and early 1990s that were essentially identifying climate change as a potential risk for fires. And basically, if you talk to them now, they'll say, "Well, we told you this back
Mhm.
there in 1990." So everybody in the fire business and most other informed people realize that climate change is happening, and climate change is exacerbating our fire regimes, and fire and climate change is getting worse. And you talk about news that's not very uplifting. We're not making any progress on reducing climate change. It's getting worse, and it's going to get worse. As it gets worse, there's going to be more and more fires and more problems. And in fact, uh, a couple of my colleagues and I did a paper back about 2013, I believe it was, where we looked at to what extent can we measure the changes in the fire season. And we found that the fire season in Alberta was beginning earlier and ending later. And we found that the fire season in Eastern Ontario and Western Ontario was not starting earlier but ending later. So is that because of climate change? Well, I think to me it's pretty obvious. But more importantly, there are groups of climatologists now that specialize in attribution research. And whenever we have a bad fire season, they can use what they call attribution methods to go through and give you an estimate of what is the likelihood that this fire season became this severe because of climate change, and they do it on a regular basis.
Mhm.
So we know that climate change is worsening fire regimes. The other part of your question is, and that's a very good question that most people haven't paid much attention to what extent will fires e- accelerate climate change as a feedback mechanism? Uh, and when forests sequester carbon. When you burn them, the carbon gets released. Uh, Eventually, the trees will grow again, and the carbon will get sequestered back there. But for in the short term, there's more carbon put into the atmosphere. But if you do more and more burning than was typical in before we were having a significant impact, then there's going to be less carbon in the forest and more carbon in the air. If there's more carbon in the air, then climate change is going to be worse. And we have a particularly difficult problem emerging in Canada. We have a lot of peatlands.
Mhm.
Uh, and in the past, peatlands did not burn very well comparison with what they do today. And because of climate change, those peatlands are going to dry and they're going to burn. And it's not just going to be the pine needles that are burning and putting carbon in the air. We're going to be burning peat deposits and putting that carbon in the air. So
Mhm.
that's a positive feedback mechanism. And the word positive isn't really appropriate, but that's going to probably, you'd have to speak to, a climatologist and an ecologist. But my concern is that climate change will result in more peat burning, which will accelerate climate change, and it will be worse.
Well, I have friends in Russia, and about 5 years ago, there was a huge a fire, a peat fire, near
Yeah.
some of the cities where they lived. I think even Moscow. But the whole air was you could hardly walk outside because of it. I don't understand why peat would burn. I would think being underground, it has to have oxygen, doesn't it, to burn? But they seem to burn, and not only do they burn, but they burn like forever. It's really hard to put out a peat fire, and like years they keep burning. And so have we had any like that in Canada? I know they've
Yes,
had
we
them in
definitely
Russia.
Yes, we definitely have.
Mhm.
The most contentious peat fires that I'm aware of are in northern Alberta, and we have had peat fires that survived the winter. There was a time when we had peat fires burning in northwestern Ontario back in the 1970s, and there was concern that they would emerge and cause problems in the following spring. It turned out in that case that there was sufficient snow that when the snow melted, the water extinguished the peat fires. But you'd have to go look at the Alberta Forest Service website. But I believe the last couple, at least 2 years ago, they had peat fires that survived the winter and continued to burn into the next year.
Well, I know
So
Russia gets plenty of snow still, even though, I mean, maybe not as much as they used to, but that didn't put it out because I know people were talking about these fires have been burning for years. And
Oh yeah, like when you get peat fires, some of them will probably get extinguished by the snow, but some of them won't. Uh, and they're incredibly difficult to extinguish even during the summer when you can put fire crews in there.
because
It's
you
just a
can't put enough water on it, would they what do they try to do? What is the strategy for trying to put out a peat fire? Do you choose a certain area, make a little trench with your water that you're trying to encircle the fire with saturated soil or what?
I just don't know enough about how they
Okay.
you'd best talk to somebody from Alberta.
Yeah.
I really don't know enough about how they try to deal with
Well,
them.
now there's another angle about climate that is not noticed enough, and I'm very concerned because I'm spending half of my time these days with on climate change issues, and some of my friends work on the Arctic ice. Well, not just the Arctic, but the Himalayas, the ice glaciers, and places like that. But I just interviewed a woman who had gone all the way from some place in Norway all the way across the North Pole to the other side to Alaska someplace, and taking cores of ice and examining the surface of the ice. And the ice is now covered in many, many places with black soot, carbon. And these carbon, they know where it comes from. It comes from forest fires, maybe the previous summer. And this is sufficient to change the albedo, to reduce the albedo, because it turns out that global warming is caused not just by fossil fuels and the carbon in the air, the carbon dioxide and methane and so on, but also by the reflectivity of the earth. And the earth reflects a huge, huge amount of the incoming sunshine by clouds and by ice. And when you cover the ice with black soot, it doesn't reflect it. So that is one of the major factors. And according to Jim Hansen, I think something like 50% of the current global warming is caused by the diminishing albedo effect. That is, the number of clouds have been reduced, and certainly the in the Arctic, the and other places like glaciers and in the Himalayas and other mountainous areas. It's covered. They're covering the surface of the ice with this black. Apparently, it's really, really black, and not just a little bit, but it's bad. And that is enough to really affect global warming immensely. I bet nobody in forestry is talking about that. Are these guys worried about that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
We worry about it just like you do.
yeah,
There's not much we can do about it
yeah,
other than to reduce area burned, which
yeah,
is a challenge.
yeah.
But people in the fire business have known for a long time that the fires emit smoke that go long distances.
Mhm.
Uh, we've seen newspaper coverage that some of the smoke plumes this year went to Spain. We know that smoke gets up into the northern circumpolar, airflows and gets deposited. In fact, one of the ways in which we can sort of infer what historical fire regimes were was by working with these climatologists who dig ice cores and can find out by looking at the amount of carbon in the ice core when there were particularly bad fire seasons. So people in the forest fire business are aware of this problem. Uh, it's 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 just you know uh,
The world is not treating it as an emergency the way I would like for it to be treated. Oh, this
Well, that could be, but the other thing, though, but there is, quite frankly, another urgent aspect of smoke that people have only started to pay attention in recent years, and that is wildfire smoke is a health hazard.
is.
So every summer you see people in communities, particularly for the most part in Alberta and British Columbia, but more recently in Ontario and Quebec, where smoke from distant fires was reducing air quality in the city, and we have healthcare specialists that are now pointing out that as a potentially very significant health risk. So that's another important aspect of fire that has become identified and not people didn't pay a lot of attention to in the past.
I had a personal experience once, 30 years ago or something. A woman next door went to sleep, or I think she was drunk and fell asleep with a frying pan on the stove. So the huge smoke in the hall, and I called the fire department and all of that. And it was so bad that the next day I could hardly go to work. My lungs were so full of this stuff. And I remember reading at the time that the number of people who are in health have health effects because of a fire in their homes or any other place, it's more often from smoke inhalation than from actually getting burnt. And I suppose that is also true when it comes to forest fires. That the forest fires have to have an impact on our. And people talk about well, they come into my house and they say, "Oh, it's bad out there." In the summer it's all smoky. Well, I don't go out, so I wouldn't know. But yeah, too bad. Okay, Dave, this has been such fun, and I finally got caught up with you. And so interesting. I wish I'd talked to you years ago, but now I have all kinds of extra reasons and motivation for doing it. We could go on for another hour, but I'm gonna call up to an end. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too. So give my love to Marion and the family, and I'll see you another time. Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.